So here we are again. We are back with the second video, and I'm quite excited actually to be able to continue this discussion on C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man. And I would like to get into it straight away because I would hope for this second part to be just a bit shorter than the initial one that we did. And for anyone who is watching this video first, I have included the link of the initial video below and would suggest that it is probably best to start with that one because it definitely provides just more background and context to what we're talking about today. Because in our discussion today, in this final part, we will be discussing the implications of those two competing worldviews and essentially what is the central argument of the book, the one we discussed last time. Also, I should note, I guess, that because again, initially my intention was for this to be a single video, which I ended up then splitting. I am aware of the fact that this will hardly be concluded in just these two parts that I am putting together here, and it is very likely then that we end up having more videos on this particular book, especially if that is something that anyone watching this has interest in. That's because we can, and I can barely and hardly even just scratch the surface of this book in just these two parts, especially again to the extent that I am doing this here. True works of genius cannot be uncovered in a video or two, and I am in no way claiming that this is an exhaustive account by any means, simply because there's just much more that can be said here. And if anything, this is one of the ways in which you actually know that you are indeed dealing with a masterpiece, because it is through reading it and studying it and apprehending it and continuing to interpret it, you find that it has a kind of inexhaustible capacity to generate very deep meaning while also revealing how relevant that meaning is now, today, as well as yesterday, but also tomorrow. And that is why it is a masterpiece. It is timeless. And we should be doing our best to understand those things that are timeless. Chances are they matter. But anyways, and just so we can get back on track and back to the main topic of today. So, or maybe, in a way to maybe give a bit of a summary, I guess, to that last video, just so that this is not too disjunctive, though it could easily remain, and it is a standalone topic by itself. But what we ended up doing last time really was we ended up doing this comparison between the classical and the modern world, and we did that through the lens of this book. And one of those key points was that by changing the conception of knowledge or education, we actually changed the conception of the world. And our comparison started there, from where we ended up drawing out these two different worlds and then also their logical outworkings. And so what we understood was this, that the classical worldview accepted the notion that objective value was something that was present in the universe and that it existed out there. It was universal, which is why it is time and place invariant. The classical education then, which is what we received through the classical liberal arts, that was the respective education in this world, and its aim was to teach us how to understand that objective value and meaning that is present and inherent in the world around us, and then what we are meant to do is act in accordance to it, which is what allows us to, it guides us really in the direction of living prosperous and fulfilled lives in relation to that which is true, good, and beautiful. It allowed us to establish a connection really between us and that which is eternal. So again, this is sort of a brief summary of the classical view that we looked at. With the other one that we discussed, which is the modern view, you could very much say that it is a mirrored view. Reason for that is because it rejects that notion that universal value is something that exists out there. The modern view would claim that there's no particular objective moral or natural order to the universe, and that anything that is or anything that exists all of that can and also must be controlled, manipulated, and altered by and also in accordance to man's desires, because man is the only source and arbiter of truth. The education that follows from that rejects the existence and legitimacy of that which cannot be measured and observed in this new modern world now. Education here is completely redefined, as it focuses primarily and only on the continual and exponential ability for control and mastery over physical and metaphysical, material and immaterial reality in accordance with man's subjective preference and choice through the skillful utilization of science, technology, and the state. But in the case that we already made last time, and what we understand from reading the book, is that reality that is reduced to value-free nature through the scientifically defined facts results in our humanity being viewed in the same way, and that is simply because humanity is part of nature. And if nature is to be manipulated and controlled and bent really to the desires of those with power, it becomes inevitable then that our humanity will then be treated in the same way. Which is why, again, we have this title of the book, The Abolition of Man. And clearly we can see that, the consequences of that are undesirable, to say the least. And that's the case for a number of reasons, but I have focused on two. Because of the rejection that we experience then of objective value and meaning, this is what leads to a severe personal impoverishment of the individual, because now there's no navigating mechanism by which the individual can be guided. And the second one will have to do with our desire for this guiding principle, right? For this kind of moral anchor, if you will. And through our misguided attempt then to rediscover one, what we end up doing is transgressing and by going beyond really the boundaries of humanity in a way where we aim to become free from reality itself and free from our own human nature. What we end up doing in this attempt is devastating or annihilating humanity, and we do that again by abolishing our human nature. And in a sense, this is a broad summary again of that first video. And let's continue then, since we could say that we're a bit more caught up here. Well, up until now, what we've done is we have focused on that initially conceived conception of the world and the mode of education that follows, and then the world that mode of education creates after itself, because again, it is the conception of education that is what shapes the world. And so naturally, a question that may follow is, well, how should we then organize our view of the world and therefore our education? What world do we want to live in? And Lewis's opinion would be that it is only the Tao, which is again that doctrine of objective value, that can provide a common human law of action which can overarch both rulers and ruled alike. He would say that it is a dogmatic belief in objective value that is what's necessary to the very idea of a rule that is not tyranny and obedience that is not slavery. And well, I don't see how it might be difficult to recognize all of that as true, because we are either to be bound by an objective view of truth and reality, or we become subjects to someone's subjective understanding and interpretation of that. And all in all, and in order to go back to that initial claim of the fact that a dogmatic belief in objective value is what's necessary, well, here's why I believe that he believes that, and many others have made this case, but I believe it actually get a very good grasp on this, because it is of very practical importance to us and also to the way we structure our societies. And well, I'll even say this, that understanding this may actually provide us with a great insight into the present cultural and historical moment that we actually find ourselves in today. And 2021. Reason for that is that we might very well be living in the ethic of this fundamental shift of understanding in the depiction that the book gives of that. Or to explain this in another way, if any of us have wondered or have found themselves even surprised by how fragile and vulnerable our civil liberties have shown themselves to be in the midst of this crisis that we're in, I do believe that the book actually gives us a fundamental or a foundational explanation of that, which is why I have found it, well, a good read, let's say. And I will attempt to discuss this in a way by providing some examples, some tangible examples, I guess, to the degree that talking about abstract concepts can be considered tangible. And I will be doing this in a way, maybe even moving away from the book to a particular degree. I think that might be an interesting way to go about it. So, some of our, let's say, presumably cherished, but ironically undervalued concepts, say human rights or individual rights or freedoms. These concepts, they're abstract concepts, and though being such, the general or the necessary agreement so far has been that they exist, though none of us has actually seen or touched them. As in, none of us has actually seen or touched a human right. And there's nothing profound here, but despite the fact that we do not experience them in the way we experience other phenomena, as individuals and then also on a societal level, our institutions have done a decent job, you could say, when it comes to not questioning their existence. But all this gets more interesting here, because these concepts, they are not implicit in scientific materialism, as in they're not perceivable to us the way trees are perceivable. These concepts are the derivatives of datums that must be accepted as axiomatic or as ontological primaries. So what this means is that they cannot just simply be reduced to other terms. Consciousness, for example, is a good example given of such primary because it cannot be derived from anything. It is sui generis. It is a primary constituent of the universe. It is why in the U.S. Declaration of Independence, those concepts there are being referred to as self-evident and not obvious, because if they were obvious, they would obviously have been there at the very beginning of any human civilization. They're self-evident because they neither require nor do they admit proof, as Lewis would say. And as we said in the previous video, these concepts are not something that we can actually reason ourselves to, but we actually reason our way from them. They are to be accepted as a premise as opposed to being pursued as a conclusion. And so, well, what does all of this mean then? Well, in a sense, it tells us that we cannot arrive at those through the deductive capacity or scientific ability to generate proof, something that we take great pride in our modern world, because even logic itself or any other empirical endeavor relies on that axiomatic premise and on that which must be accepted as a given. This seems to imply this then, that the very notion that is accepted as self-evident, it remains an assumption which can only be arrived at through revelation and can only be accepted as true on the basis of faith. And this is a fascinating idea that we should probably actually looking into in another video, simply because, well, chances are that's necessary to be done. But even that gets more interesting because faith itself undergirds reason, because you have to make a fundamental assumption in order to get to reason in the first place, which again is something we should look at another time. But the idea here is this, that without the initial self-evident premise as foundational, those concepts that the premise has produced cannot just remain suspended mid-air and also retain their validity. Reason for that is that, well, logic itself has collapsed now. Now, this debunking then that we see and this dismissal of that initial axiom can only result in the invalidation of what it has produced, i.e., human rights or individual rights or freedom. Reason for that is, again, in order to make the rational case for the legitimacy of that, well, that itself has been made impossible now because there's no ground on which the case can be made. In formal logic as a discipline, this would be a case of insisting on the conclusion of a syllogism, the premise of which you reject. And we can illustrate this by a use of example and look at a syllogism. So here's one. If all men are sons and Adam is a man, Adam is therefore a son. And I'm pretty sure that this paints the picture in a clear way, but the idea is that the conclusion here is correct only if we accept the premise. Without accepting the premise, there's no reason for us, or there's no foundation that allows us to accept the conclusion as true. And so, or to say this in another way, here's something we cannot say. Here's an inarguable truth. Objective truth does not exist. And again, I would hope that these examples depict what I'm trying to explain here. But in order to bring this back to the ground, the irony really is here that even those who are very quick to proudly express their unbelief and skepticism in that which gives justification for morality and justice, say universal values, they still expect to be treated morally and justly. But on the basis of what do they then do that, if all of that is simply just subjective? But in any event, all of this would naturally indicate that on both individual and a societal level, we're left with two options, and it is crucial to understand this. If there are any takeaways here, it's probably this, because on one hand, we either accept that there is a divine cosmic order and accept the existence of universal and objective value as an innate and inherent part of the universe, nature, and being, and that we are obligated to align ourselves with this rudimentary pattern of that which is eternal because we are a part of it and it is a part of us. Accepting this is what allows us to preserve a free and a liberal, in a classical term, a liberal society in which the individual has value and also has rights. The alternative would be that we have to admit that there are no ordering principles to which we are beholden to, simply because there exists no valid or invalid source, arbiter, or method for establishing truth. Truth itself is absent from the universe because the universe is one that lacks the requisite substance and capacity to produce anything that is indeed discernible, meaning there exists no distinction between good and evil, or up and down, or male and female, right and wrong. To return back to, I'm looking at the apple there behind me, and to return to the example that we used, we could say that to save the apple would be no better or worse choice than to save the puppy. Everything in this world would simply be a matter of perspective and preference and subject to our manipulation. But the result of this embrace is only one. We are simultaneously and infinitely liberated, but also confined by this absence of truth. But then this, the very reason that both of these would be considered in the first place would be in the pursuit of the good, or the good life. And this is a question that we shouldn't be too quick to ignore, because, well, why pursue that in the first place, right? Why the good life, and good for what? Good in relation to what? How can it be good if good itself is not something that exists, or if good is simply just a matter of opinion? But we can leave this to the side in order to just progress with this, because, well, what do we do with all of that and with this predicament that we find ourselves in. And we mentioned that in the previous video, that much of this subjectivist view seems to have developed in a way parallel to the increasing technological advancement of our society. And though realistically technology does seem to be mostly amoral, though there's some exceptions there, what I mean by that is that clearly it is not inherently good or bad, but rather it is our particular use of it that determines its moral quality. And again, I know we said this last time about Lewis, where he says that technology's proper place is as a servant that seeks to understand instead of a master of control. And it is unfortunate that this increasing technological advancement has come at the expense of our understanding or connection to that which is transcendent in a sense. Now, as far as the education, it does seem that classical education will be an essential part in these souls reorienting towards the good. And despite it being ancient in its origin, it might just be our most advanced tool in our attempt to discover and ascertain truth. Truth being the mediator really between us and reality. It is our only link to reality. Now, all of this should not be mistaken for an attempt to seek a moral order in life through a specific religious view of the world. That is a case that Lewis does not make anywhere in the book. And I am saying this because very often classical education is castigated as being culturally or primarily Western or European or Christian dominant, which is incorrect, which is why Lewis specifically refers to the doctrine of objective values as the Tao, meaning he specifically uses an Eastern term for that. The education itself was reflective of a classical world, again, a world that believes in the Tao. The West had its own canon, which was the West's contribution to this project through the liberal arts. And the liberal arts, again, being our mediator to objective value. But the Chinese had theirs, and so did the Hebrews and the Indians and any other culture. The claim here really is this, that morality precedes religion and not vice versa. Religious traditions are man's attempts to encapsulate morality in his conduct, custom, and tradition. Religion is really the codifying of those attempts. And I'm saying this because very often what I've just discussed is one of the inadequacies of thinking of the philosophical and theological vein of Western tradition as confined to a specific time period, really, or a geographical region, because it is clear that some of its intellectual roots spread outside of the European continent. The West itself is a product of an ancient tradition that finds its origin in ancient Israel and Greece and Rome, ancient civilizations which themselves find intellectual and philosophical roots in ancient Egyptian and Mediterranean and Mesopotamian context, really. Realistically, this is as inclusive as it gets. But, well, I'll say this here, and this might be controversial. It's a big claim, right? Despite all of that, the view of man and his nature, and the view of his participation in, or the view of his relationship with that which is eternal, might be best articulated in the Judeo-Christian tradition, and likely finding its most well-rounded and complete iteration of philosophy in Christianity. Now, this does not mean that it is unique to Christianity, but it seems to be described in the most complete form there. And so, if that is true, we're left then with this overall sentiment and the disposition that the main tenets of the Judeo-Christian ethic and the philosophical and moral and intellectual thought that makes up its DNA, that those are indeed true. And when I say true, I mean it as in true despite any successful or failed or flawed attempts of the church to communicate that. True in a way really as being part of what's constructive of the universe and the metaphysical foundation of truth itself. This would then mean that they're not arbitrary, as in, they're not just one of the many conventionally derived presumptions of the particular culture, and they serve as a credible expression of the central human tendency towards unification and civilization. They're Western models, yes, but at their very core, they're fundamentally human, and even beyond that, because they're linked to the emergence of ethical behavior in animals, which makes a very strong case for morality being grounded in biology and having a long, long evolutionary history. In my humble view, the very fact that the humankind, have, the fact that we have somehow conceived the existence of universal truths and then took part in their continual discovery and expression, and the fact that those were then used by us, by humankind, for the foundation of our societies, all of this seems so unlikely that it could and it must even be deemed impossible. And yet it happened. And so, because of that, it is very unfortunate that a lot of what we see today, which is all of these epistemological and moral relativists who, with a kind of characteristic flippancy and irreverence, dismiss anything that is true, good, and beautiful and virtuous, they make a fatal mistake because they fail to grasp the weight and the severity of the result of their advances. Because dispensing with these universal values because of an impulse to replace them with something that is better or more modern or fairer or more inclusive, as it is contrived by the particularly the finite subjectivist mind of today, all of that comes only at the greatest cost of all, which is being itself. But even that is an arrogant claim of sort, for we do not have the power to abolish being, since, and again, as hopefully clarified, reason for that is that we are not the source of being. It is very likely that the universe will continue to exist without us. And so this then means that all that is at stake is the extent to which being is present in us or manifested by us. And so, or let's leave that here because I can see that we have progressed in time. And well, I do hope that this has been a sufficient argument for all of that, and I hope that it has been interesting. All I'm doing here is really, though I am presenting this, I am more so asking the question. In saying this, I should also say that I am not looking for an agreement with this main argument that I have presented in order to proclaim it to be true, nor that any disagreement with it invalidates its truth. My aim here is not to be right, but to declare this as true very much independently of myself, or see how it is not so, right? If anything, this has been the point of this whole thing, because the idea is that truth does not change based on our apprehension of it. The declarative pronouncement here is that truth is what exists, and anything else is just an opinion. We can either be those who strive to understand truth, or lovers of wisdom, or we would be what Plato would call philodoxers, or lovers of opinion. But as this is on YouTube, and this is an open discussion, and we should certainly explore this more because it is quite interesting to do so. If there are any competing views, those are to be advanced in challenging this analysis, and we should be very, very welcoming of this. And this is not done necessarily with me or with this video, because what do I know? But more so doing so in your daily conduct or your relationship with others, and seeing how reality or the world responds to that. So again, any opposing views here are best presented through the strength of an argument or through the embodiment of the disagreement. But in the case there's no sufficient argument, and even opponents themselves can see how those consequences the idea of dispensing with those values are undesirable. Their opposition is only an illusion, or at least something on the surface, because it is their own human nature that is also what's at stake here. And again, that's the entire idea that we've discussed here, that in the same way that we cannot disregard physical laws of nature, the same is the case for moral law. I do believe that this is a good place to end this, and we'll do this again in the next video.